Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I have a special video, something I don't do quite often, but I might do more in the future because I think that a lot of you will like this format. We're going to look at 5 beliefs that are very current in the strength training community, and I'm going to tell you, are they myths or are they actually reality? And I'm going to give you briefly my opinion on each of them. So no fancy introduction, no success stories this week. So just let's get on with it. I'm going to blow myself up a bit here. All right. So quick hits, myth or reality. The first one we're going to look at is the deadlift is one of the best exercises to build muscle. Is that a myth or is it true? Well, I won't make many friends here, and I want to talk about context here first. I'm a former Olympic lifter. I've also trained for strength for football. So most of my training career was getting stronger on the big basic lifts, including the deadlift. So deadlift, squat, bench press, clean, snatches. These were my main movements for roughly 12 to 15 years of my training career. Even when I stopped Olympic weightlifting, I moved on to more of a powerlifting training, and still the deadlift was one of my main movements. So I will tell you, I do not hate the deadlift. I still use it quite a bit with athletes, with powerlifters, but I don't see it as a great movement to increase muscle mass or as a great hypertrophy exercise, especially not for how much you are investing effort-wise and recovery-wise when doing it. Because the greatest strength of the deadlift is also its greatest weakness. It involves so many different muscle groups that you can't really put a lot of stimulus on any specific muscle. At least not better than alternative exercises. For example, it's true that the deadlift is a great posterior chain movement, but the Romanian deadlift is actually a much more effective movement to really target the hamstrings and the glutes. So the deadlift, the traditional deadlift from the floor, is actually not great at building any specific muscle. It will work the glutes, the hamstrings, the quads, the lower back and the traps, the upper back to some extent, but never to the point of putting a great training stimulus on any of these muscles. It would be much more effective to focus on exercises that can better target these areas. Now, where the deadlift is a great movement is as an overall strength builder. It is one of the best movement to get stronger. That is an absolute fact. In fact, the strength you gain on a deadlift is likely the most transferable strength to real life activities and could even be very useful in sport, for example. So I do see it as a good lift. If your goal is to get overall stronger, if you're competing in powerlifting, you obviously have to do it. If you're a strongman competitor, you also need to be really good at the deadlift. But if you're a bodybuilder and your whole only goal is to get bigger, it might not be the best investment for your money. Now, just look at the internet. I've never seen a lift where you see people who are skinny with no muscle lift as much weight as you do on a deadlift. You will see plenty of guys who don't carry lots of muscle still deadlift quite a bit of weight because of good leverages. For example, if the deadlift was a great muscle builder, all these guys deadlifting 500 or 600 would also have the muscle mass to justify that strength, but you don't see it. Very rarely will you see a guy bench pressing 400 or squatting 500 with no legs and no chest or arms. Okay, so that, to me, that's another example of why the deadlift is not a great muscle building exercise. It's great for strength, not so much for muscle mass. You can't build muscle and lose fat at the same time. Well, it's pretty much true, but not completely, okay? There are some exceptions. First, if you're a beginner, you can build muscle mass while losing body fat because the body is so not used to the stimulus of training that even a small amount of training, even any training at all really, will actually lead to muscle growth. You need very little stimulus to force the body to adapt, because if you are so undertrained that any type of physical work represent a huge stress on your body, the priority of your body will be to protect itself against that stress in the future. The same thing can be said if you have not trained for a while, maybe a few months, you lost some muscle. Well, if you start training, you might regain that muscle faster, even if you're in a caloric deficit. Okay, because you already had that muscle, you maintain some of the adaptations, it's much easier to regain it. Now, so, but in most situations, okay, it is very hard to build a significant amount of muscle while losing a significant amount of body fat. Okay, you can gain a little bit amount of muscle and lose a little bit of fat at the same time. That's doable, but it will take a lot longer to reach your optimal goal, and you need to be very precise with your nutrition, because in reality, okay, in theory, it is possible to gain muscle while in a caloric deficit, because what you need to build muscle is first a stimulus that's provided by weight training. So you can give the stimulus to your body with or without sufficient calories, right? Second, you need enough protein. So if you are in a caloric deficit, you can still have a protein intake that is high enough to trigger muscle growth. So we can talk about 1 pound per body weight, for 1 gram per pound of body weight. So if you are 200 pounds, you go with 200 grams of protein, 225. That's enough protein to support muscle growth. The third thing you need is an energy supply, because muscle growth is an energy-dependent process. And if you're on a deficit, it's obviously harder to have enough energy to fuel that process. But if you have a decent amount of body fat, you can mobilize that body fat to fuel the muscle growth process. So it's still possible to have all three variables. So it is possible on paper to gain muscle while you're in a caloric deficit if you train hard enough, if you have enough protein, and if you still have some body fat that you can use to fuel the process. However, several factors involved in muscle growth will be minimized when you are on a caloric deficit, and some will actually be counterproductive. For example, when you are in a caloric deficit, especially if you consume very little carbs, so your carbs are low, well, your insulin will be lower and your IGF-1 will be lower. IGF-1 is highly dependent on insulin levels also. So insulin is both anabolic and anti-catabolic. We often see it as the devil because it can make it harder to lose fat, but it's also very important to build muscle. And it will lead to an increase in IGF-1, which is the most anabolic hormone in the body. You don't get those as much when you're dieting down, especially if you have a low carbs diet. Then there's the issue of mTOR activation. mTOR activation will be triggered by training, but it's also magnified by having an insulin spike and sufficient calories. So if you are in a caloric deficit, mTOR activation is lower, protein synthesis will not be elevated as much. So right from the start, we have 3 hormonal or enzyme responses that will be much less than if you have ample calories, so making the whole process harder. Also, you will have higher cortisol levels when you're dieting down. One of the main functions of cortisol is to mobilize stored energy when you are not eating enough to fuel your daily activities. The higher, the lower, the greater the deficit, the more cortisol you produce. Cortisol is also catabolic, so it will hurt you when it comes to building muscle, and it can actually make you lose muscle. So because of these reasons, it's actually very hard to build a good amount of muscle while you are on a deficit, but it's not impossible. If protein and calories are the same, you'll lose the same amount of fat regardless of nutrients ratio. Okay, that's a very popular belief at the moment from the evidence-based group that look at the studies, and studies have shown that if protein and calories are the same, it really doesn't matter if you're consuming more carbs, more fat, if you're keto, if you're hard carbs, there's no difference if the protein and calories are the same. Basically, they say that the only thing that matters when it comes to losing fat are calories and protein. In reality, that's not exactly true for several reasons. Yes, calories are super important, probably the most important factors, but the nutrients ratio also play a role. First, because of the hormonal response. if you go lower carbs, you will increase cortisol more than if you have carbs in your diet. In fact, the best quote unquote supplement to lower cortisol levels is carbohydrates. It's not a fancy product. It's not a fancy supplement from Russia. It's simple carbs, because one of the main functions of cortisol is to mobilize stored energy and to maintain a stable blood sugar level. If blood sugar level drops down too much, the hormones responsible for bringing it back up are glucagon and cortisol. Growth hormone playing a smaller role, but still can play a role. So if your blood sugar drops down, which will happen when your carbs are low, you will increase cortisol more than if you can maintain a stable blood sugar level. And the cortisol element, well, cortisol can make you lose muscle tissue. It can also slow down muscle growth. And when it comes to losing fat over the long term, it can slow down metabolic rate. It does that by taking the T4 thyroid hormone and preventing it from being converted into T3. The body produces mostly T4, okay, directly, which is relatively inactive when it comes to the metabolic rate. It will convert it to T3 in the amount it deems safe for its survival. If you don't give your body enough energy, it will sense that it can't maintain as much of an energy expenditure. It will slow down the conversion of T4 into T3 to decrease your metabolic rate so that you don't run the risk of running into problems by not having enough calories in your diet or enough energy in your diet. The main thing that does that is cortisol. When cortisol is too high, systematically, it tells your body that it is underfed. It constantly needs to mobilize stored energy, which is the main function of cortisol. And cortisol will actually block that conversion. And over the long run, it can lead to a lower T3 level. Now, every time you are on a deficit, that can happen. But if you have low carbs, it is more likely to happen and could happen sooner. So right from the start, there is a difference between two types of diet. The problem is that might take 8-10 weeks to happen. And when you look at most studies on fat loss, they will last 8 to 10 weeks, very rarely longer. So at the conclusion of the diet, these metabolic adaptations have not occurred yet, or have not occurred for long enough to make a difference in the measurements. So it's pretty easy to say, well, there's no difference. Well, there might be some differences if you keep going on for 10 more weeks, for example. Other thing is that depending on your genetics, you will be better at handling carbs or fat. That is highly dependent on your ancestry. For example, you look at people in the Scandinavian countries, they will be much better at dealing with a higher fat intake than a high carbs intake. If you look at the Asian population, it's the opposite. They will tolerate carbs a lot better than fats. So there will be a difference between those populations. So yes, caloric intake is the most important thing, but it is not the only thing that matters when it comes to getting lean. You can't outtrain a bad diet. You absolutely can outtrain a bad diet. I'm not saying it's smart. I'm not saying it's healthy. But I've seen a lot, and I mean a lot, of athletes who looked amazing and ate like crap. I mean, I'm talking shredded guys eating fast food at least once a day. When I was training Daryl G, who competed at the Olympia in the 202 class back in the days, 10 weeks prior to the show, he was still having one fast food meal a day. Of course, he was on steroids, so that kind of changed things. But even with regular athletes, I mean, we've seen Michael Phelps eat McDonald's daily. Usain Bolt live on chicken nuggets. Matt Frazier, I've seen Matt Frazier eat 2 Big Macs 30 minutes before the final WOD of regionals when one of the athletes that was training was competing. I've seen all sorts of things, and if people have a high enough volume of training, well, you know what? If you are expending 5,000 calories a day, even if you're eating a tub of ice cream every day, you'll look super lean, okay? So you can outtrain a bad diet when it comes to fat level, okay? What the problem will be, though, is that a bad diet will be high in refined sugar, will be high in bad fats, will be high in inflammatory material. So down the line, it can lead to health issues. But if we're talking about like getting leaner, sure, I think a good diet is a much smarter way, a much easier ways of doing things. But if your training is high enough in energy expenditure, you can absolutely out-train a bad diet. Again, I'm not saying it's smart, because oftentimes the amount of work needed to out-train a bad diet is so high that it will basically be a full-time job, or will leave you drained and feeling like crap all the time. But saying it's not possible is just not true. Abs are made in the kitchen, okay? Well, if that were true, then all the people that were recovered from concentration camps would all have a six-pack. Christian Bale would have a nasty six-pack in the Machinist when he lost like 100 pounds. Basically, I don't like using those images, because, I mean, I don't like using the suffering of people to drive a point home. But the fact is that, you know, even if you're super lean, even if you have basically no body fat on you, you still need to have muscle thickness to show definition. I mean, we've seen Christian Bale in American Psycho with a nasty six-pack. Even in Batman Returns, when he was fatter, he still had some abdominal definition. So we know for a fact that Christian Bale has abdominals. But by becoming so lean, undernourished, he lost the muscle mass in his abdominal, and he lost the definition. What I'm saying is that if you don't have the muscle mass in your abdominal muscles, even if you get lean, you won't show the definition. By extension, if you make those abdominal muscles thicker, then even when you're not super lean, you will have definition, because thicker muscles will push more. Thicker abdominal bellies will have a greater separation between the lines between the six-pack, and creating more of a definition look. Abdominals are my best muscle, because I've always trained them heavy, because I needed them for stability for the sports I played. Nowadays, even if my body fat is higher, if I let it creep up to 15%, I still have a six-pack, because the abdominal muscles are so thick that you have definition. By extension, someone who never trains abs, or don't have natural abdominal definition, even if they diet down and be super lean, they might not have those abdominals. So abdominals are not made in the kitchen, meaning that it's not just a matter of getting lean. You'd still need the muscle to be there. Good example, if you search Boyer Coe, even in competition, Boyer Coe was one of the best bodybuilders of his era. He had zero abdominal definition because he lacked the thickness there. My ex-girlfriend, she competed nationally in bodybuilding, same thing. She had striated rhomboids, but she had no abdominal definition because she never trained them heavy enough to create hypertrophy there. So abdominals are built in the gym when you train them. They are revealed in the kitchen when you diet down. Okay, I understand the purpose of the abs are made in the kitchen saying, basically emphasizing that if you want abs, you need to get lean. And it's true. But if the muscle is not there in the first place, it won't show if you get lean. Okay, we've all seen the skinny guys with zero abdominal definition, even if they're like 8% body fat. Some people will have great abdominal genetics that will show the six-pack even without training them, but most people will need to make those muscles thicker with training. So these are the 5 myths I wanted to address. Hopefully, I didn't ruffle too many feathers. If I didn't, I might do this in the near future. So see you guys next time.